When This One's Wife Met H.G. Volume 2, Part 3. You will recall that I was at a formal function which was attended by This One's Wife and Prince Harry. This One's Wife was wearing astroturf, and, in the course of introductions to those attending, Prince Harry had left the main room for some unexplained reason. I was in a group with 3 others, Chelsea politician, the Minister Councillor, and Fatty Hornet, the pastry fiend. This One's Wife had been guided around the room, and it now came time for her to be introduced to us. If we could interrupt, asked our host, as she and This One's Wife penetrated our group. The conversation halted as all faces turned towards This One's Wife. She smiled widely at our group, an almost reptilian grin of one anticipating a meal. "This is Minister Councillor Smooth and Polite," introduced our host. "Your Royal Highness," he greeted with a nod of the head. "How are you today?" asked This One's Wife as she then shook hands. "Trying to avoid too much taffy," responded the Minister Councillor. I was watching This One's Wife carefully. Once she had shaken hands, she retracted her hands to position them on her green bump. It looked like she was carrying a hillock around with her. There was the briefest of pauses as she digested the response from the Minister Councillor before she replied, "Oh yes, it is very sweet," and emitted a short laugh. I noted that it was clear to my expert eye that she had no interest in maple taffy, but knew enough to issue a response. I doubt the others saw it, but I witnessed the transition. When she immediately reached our group, her eyes were flickering back and forth, anticipation gunning their movement. The response of the Minister Councillor, naturally smooth and polite, however, had disappointed her, because whilst he responded to her, he spoke about himself and asked nothing of her. There was a momentary glaze in her eyes before she offered her reply. "May I introduce Fatty Hornet?" continued our host, as she motioned towards our pastry-consuming chum. "Your Royal Highness," he acknowledged and bowed his head. Before This One's Wife was able to speak, Fatty Hornet got in first. "How are you finding the pregnancy, ma'am?" he asked. "Arse-licker," I thought to myself. I looked across at Chelsea politician, who caught my eye and gave a slight eye-roll herself. I smiled briefly. The effect of the question was immediate, as her face illuminated with delight at being asked a question about her, as you would expect. "I'm super excited to welcome this one into the world," she replied, patting the top of the bump as you might pat a puppy, or, more likely, the top of Prince Harry's head. "You look very well, if I may say so," toadied Fatty Hornet. "Oh, thank you," she answered. There was a slight pause. It was evident that our host expected This One's Wife to continue speaking, but she did not do so. Instead, she looked to the host as if to signal, "Next one." "May I introduce Chelsea Politician?" the host announced. "Your Royal Highness," responded Chelsea Politician somewhat curtly, clearly not a fan of today's guest. "Oh, another non-Canadian," observed this one's wife. "I wondered where you had all been hiding," she commented, and gave an out-of-place giggle. Chelsea Politician gave a polite smile, although her eyes demonstrated the contempt that she felt for this one's wife, and she offered nothing more. She evidently had little time for this one's wife. I had observed, now that this one's wife was closer to us, a number of matters of note. The first was that there was a distinguishable, musky smell that was all of a sudden apparent. It wasn't that which came from a fragrance, but rather a somewhat funky odour. It put me in mind of clothing that had not dried properly, and this mingled with something else. I wasn't entirely sure. The best that I could deduce that it was a chemical smell, similar to that of dry, cleaned clothing. I wondered if this came from our host, but it was evident that it emanated from this one's wife. Now, I do not have the keenest sense of smell. We psychopaths tend not to. But even with that less attuned sense, I was able to discern that the odour was coming from this one's wife, and that the best description one could afford to it was funky. This one's wife, however, didn't notice it, because otherwise she presumably would have done something about it. I was mildly surprised by this development, expecting her to be more fragrant-smelling. Nevertheless, there it was. The second point to note, and this became rather obvious to me in a matter of moments, was that for someone who was well over 7 months pregnant, I saw no sign of her swelling other than in the bump that she kept touching, as if she was offering it up to us. My sister and sisters-in-law have been pregnant on numerous occasions, and I remember the tedium of their complaints. Moaning about bloody swollen ankles, and "my arse is like a burst sofa," and "my tits are like pendulous melons." Those just being an assortment of some of their observations. As I had watched this one's wife being introduced to the members of our group, it struck me that the only place that she had shown any kind of growth or swelling was in her stomach area. She is ordinarily rather flat-chested, but there had been no increase in her breast size. I recall my brother delighting in how his wife had swollen from a B-cup to a D-cup, and then lamenting a lack of action as she complained that they were too sore for his clumsy groping. This one's wife was straight down to the rear also, and what also struck me was there was no swelling in the ankles, which I understood to be a common side effect of pregnancy. In fact, she was wearing an elegant pair of black shoes with at least 4 inches on the heel, and no sign of swelling in the ankles whatsoever. I remarked on this to my sister at a later juncture when recalling the day. My sister suggested that maybe she was carrying it all in the bump, whatever that meant. With those observations duly made, and with Chelsea Politician unwilling to fawn before this one's wife, our host now made to introduce your glorious narrator.